One area I do really want to discuss is kind of post 9/11 Arab dehumanization in games. I mean, from the bad guys going from the Russians to, now the terrorists, right? These kind of just blanket bad people.
Yeah.
I mean, and you look at games like 6 Days in Fallujah, which were were approved by the soldiers that were in that battle in Fallujah.
Yeah.
That said that this story needs to be told. We approve this game, but if, Fox News said, "Oh, look, this is a game about the Iraq War. It's too early."
Yeah.
I mean, what's going on in terms of this Arab dehumanization? Will we see games with the Arab perspective or like the perspective of the enemy anytime soon?
Well, believe it or not, there actually are games that are geared towards the Americans as being the bad guys. They're not obviously popular in the United States. We don't see very there's probably not too many gaming companies, development companies that would take on that role to sell, at least within the United States. They are made. I mean, we see them being made in those countries, and they're sold in there. And I mean, they're not. I don't know I haven't seen any of them in particular, so I don't know about their graphics or their gameplay. But there are games like that do exist.
Okay.
Just like there are movies that exist where the Americans are the bad guys.
Sure.
So even though we don't see them, at least in the United States, doesn't mean that they don't exist and they're not being played. Regardless of sort of the political or social environment, I mean, war games are different in themselves.
Right.
Even the old World War II and World War I games, you sort of pick Germans as the bad guys, and then some of them in the Viet Cong, and so Vietnam conflict and things like that. Now it's just switched to a new sort of bad guy of being the Arabs, even though it's probably once again might be stereotypical of Arabs and Arab Americans and sort of their culture. So hopefully we'll see changes in sort of that of they're not all the bad guys. There are differences in them, and the really interesting the war games, because they are sometimes mirrored in political. I mean, it's just you can't separate it because you go over. Some of those are based on Middle Eastern conflicts, and that's very charged politically and economically and racially, and so it's. I think sometimes the gameplay does a good job of it, characterizing what it would be like. Although sometimes I don't know if it actually reflects the conditions, and so it's tough to say whether or not it'll change. I mean, I think it will change eventually. Like I said, we'll see diversity, and we'll see sort of more Arabs being portrayed as the good guys, and not necessarily the Americans are the bad guys, but having maybe a lead protagonist be that character and be somebody who reflects that they're not all terrorists. It's a stupid stereotype, and so we might see changes coming forth in the video game industry. But like I said, sometimes it's tough to pull apart the war. Like this is a war; these who the bad guys were, and so like I was saying in the games, the Germans were the bad guys, and the Japanese, and the Viet Cong, and so now it just happens to be the Arab Americans and people in the Middle East, and so hopefully we'll see some of those changes. But sometimes we see that these games will reflect certain situations, and so there was the one game Homefront, where North Korea are basically the bad guys, and they attack the United States and take it over, and we've done a study on the Homefront game where we've had people come in and play, and we basically manipulated the opening scene where it was they attacked the United States, and you go in and you fight in Colorado. It's a resistance to fight back and take back the United States. And the other condition we actually had where you're fighting in Austin. Like they take over Austin as part of it, and you fight in Austin as sort of an identity locale of like, this is the narrative. And we found that there were stronger reactions from people who, played in the identity location condition. Were like, hey, this is where we are. This is Austin. This is like where I live. This is where I go to school. It's more realistic to me. Showing those images and having that effect on the players. The sample who was primarily Asian American foreign students from Korea and Japan and China had really different takes on what was on the game itself, and sort of not necessarily supporting North Korea, but being I'm not maybe necessarily comfortable with the way it's being portrayed, and some of that has to do with sort of stereotypes and things like that.
Sure.
And so racing gaming is really sort of an interesting aspect of games and how it can affect outcomes of how people play, of either priming sort of stereotypes of African Americans as being aggressive, or Asians as being smart, or something along those lines, where even though some of the stereotypes can be positive, such as being smart or athletic, they're still stereotypes in and of themselves, where they represent these gross, categorizations about an entire group of individuals. And so there are good things about it of having more diversity in gaming. There are bad things about it, and so I think moving forward is understanding those negative effects and trying to sort of combat some of those stereotypes, but still incorporating diversity, because that's what it's good to have social. It's good that people understand this and learn about different cultures, but on the other side, it's also good to sort of get more representations in the bottom line of making money. So. Right. What I would say to the game developers is saying, like, by incorporating more of these representations, you can actually make more money. Even though the end goal shouldn't be always to make money, but I mean, that's what they're in business for, is to make money, is that by doing something good, having more diverse representations, occupations, roles, and not always meeting with stereotypes, your game can still be really successful. Yeah. And even maybe more so of having, reaching a wider audience in terms of demographics.
Right. So, this next question I really want to ask, and I'm not trying to be cheeky here, but is The Legend of Zelda racist? I mean, here you have the hero of time who's blonde-haired, blue-eyed, in the last game had ear piercings, I don't know. But, he's saving the princess, also, this fair, blonde-haired, blue-eyed princess, against Ganondorf, who's dark-skinned, and actually in the Twilight Princess, from the Gerudo tribe, which is very, they live in the desert. I mean, is the series racist?
Okay, so that's a good question. I don't necessarily know a direct answer for that, whether or not. I guess part of it depends on whose reaction we're talking about. Right. Okay, so we're talking about somebody who is a minority, who might view it and say, this is grossly stereotypical, or somebody who might just be, he's just an elf. This is what elves look like.
Sure.
And this is what the bad guy looks like. And so I think to define it as racist or not racist is difficult. It depends on people's reactions. Like I said, I don't think game developers get into it to promote racism. Like, nobody says, hey, let's have this.
Sure.
So I think when they were making Legend of Zelda, they're like, this is what Zelda looks like to me. He's an elf, he's got blonde hair and pointy ears, and we want the bad guy to look mean or evil. And so sometimes darker colors of black are associated, like the white is good and the black is evil in terms of colors, not actual race.
Right.
And so we see that maybe sometimes play out in the games themselves. Yeah. And so I think sometimes that racism comes through without them expecting it or wanting to they don't want to be racist. I mean, one of the games that's created a lot of controversy that I would say can be considered racist is one of the Resident Evils, where you were over and I think it's Resident Evil 5, and you're over in Africa and you're fighting the Las Plagas plague.
Yeah,
so
I remember that. Yeah.
What happened was a lot of the you're in Africa, and so you're in those small cities and tribes and things like that, and they were affected by it. So you had the African Americans were the bad guys and the zombies that come after you, and you're this white big tough guy. And so I don't necessarily think that they were like, hey, this is I think the theme played out that it was it wasn't overtly, but it could appear to be racist. And so I can understand why people's reaction was like, this isn't, and the one basically African American good guy in the game was a female, Shiva, and she was, once again, very provocative, very sexualized. And so I think in that regards, sometimes the females or women are very sexualized and objectified in the games, and we're starting to see, the game developers realize that, particularly ones that are developed, by women for women, of changing the age-old, objectification of the woman in the game of being sort of unrealistically bosomly and the expectations and things like that. Yeah. So my answer is I don't really know the answer to that, but I would say that I don't think that they meant it as being racist, and I think there are newer representations that you could say this might be. Like, I don't think the developers want it to be racist, but it can be depicted as being racist in that context. Being not necessarily racist, but stereotypical. So the images themselves aren't necessarily promoting that, we should, disallow certain groups or things like that, but it might be, basically portraying groups in certain lights, which can be viewed as stereotypical. So I think sometimes it's stereotyping, not necessarily racism, that gets pulled apart in those media representations.
So, do you think it's a Japanese thing? Because I studied a lot of Japan, and for example, a lot of the stuff that if you surveyed the Japanese, they don't view themselves as racist, right? They think that's intrinsically an American thing, right, because of our history with slavery. But of course, it's the little cameras where you could wind it up and take quick photos. Yeah. It literally they call it like stupid Korean camera, which is a camera so stupid a Korean could use it, and it's kind of like, do you think that has anything to do with it? These Japanese developers just kind of they don't have the same kind of experiences that I guess the American history has had.
That's an interesting question. I mean, you're crossing over some more cultural sort of boundaries here of what, and that clearly is going to influence how they create those games, because it's the same can be said of any type of media that they create. So their cultural identities and who they are influence their movies, their media, and all of that. And so whatever that is comes through in the media. And so gaming is no different from their television, to their books, to their television shows, movies, and things like that. And so things that produce there are probably going to reflect the cultural values. So largely, I don't know, but I would say that our cultural values of the Americans and whoever, if they're developing that, those values and beliefs are going to come through in the media that they create.
Okay.
And sometimes with unintended consequences, because the other groups of individuals, other nations and ethnicities might be like, yeah, this is stereotypical, where they might be like, well, this isn't, because our cultural value is different from yours. And so those values are going to play out in any media, and sometimes they play out in video games.
All right. And then I guess the last question I wanted to ask, so this final question, do you think the reason the Halo series has been so successful is because there's this guy in a green mask? You don't know who he is. Everyone speculated, oh, is he a black guy, is he a white guy, whatever. Do you think the fact that it is kind of just blind, he's always going to be wearing that mask, he will never even take his glove off, so you can't even see his skin color. Do you think that has anything to play with, how successful that franchise is, minus, the gameplay or the online, just that character in general? People love that character.
Yeah, I think, to me, part of it is the mystery of it. Like, who is that character?
Right.
Is it, I think most people would say it's a guy, but I guess you could be a girl. Different ethnicity, what they look like, is it a robot, who is it? And I think part of it is that ability of saying, well, we just want people to project themselves into that character. So when you're playing, I am Master Chief. So you view yourself within that suit. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's why they might be hesitant about saying, oh, this is this person, because it could basically turn off some people like, oh, that's not what I pictured. I pictured me in that suit, playing that. So by keeping it mysterious and not letting them know, you can actually probably better identify with being that character, of being in that suit and taking on the alien menace. And so I think that's part of the reason that they haven't said this is who's under the suit.
Right.
They want you to think you're under that suit. This is you. You're that character.
Oh, okay. So with that, I think we'll call it to a close. This is our first episode. Do you have a Twitter or something you'd want to plug? I mean, where can people find out more about what you're doing?
Well, basically, they can go onto the UT website, the advertising department homepage, and look up my information. I have my interest, as well as some recent publications, as well as my curriculum vitae or resume, classes I will be teaching. So I'm always promoting taking my classes if any students are watching the video, and so
Right. Very cool. So leave your comments below. Tell us what you liked. Tell us what you didn't like, and we'll catch you in the next episode.